You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This episode is about whether or not you have to choose between financial independence and having kids. And it's also about the broader question of the costs and benefits of having kids. I'm going to share with you excerpts from 2 bonus episodes of The Voluntary Life. Bonus episodes are available to listeners who support The Voluntary Life through Patreon and Bitbacker. We've got over 70 bonus episodes now, and if you are interested in getting access to those episodes, I would greatly appreciate your support on Patreon or Bitbacker. This show is only possible thanks to the support of patrons and bitbackers. If you'd like to find out more about how to support the show, I will put links in the show notes, and you can also find links on my website, thevoluntarylife.com. And in this episode, you're going to get to hear some of the things that I talk about on bonus episodes. So first of all, I'll be sharing from bonus episode 35, which is called Do You Have to Choose Between Financial Independence and Kids? And this is a response to a very interesting listener email about this topic. And directly following on from that, I'm going to add on excerpts from bonus episode 41, which is called The Costs and Benefits of Having Kids, which provides some additional data, which I think is very relevant and interesting for this question. So I hope you find these highlights from bonus episodes interesting. And without further delay, let's get into the topic of this week's episode. So first off, I'll just read the email to you. He says, "Hi Jake, I recently stumbled upon your podcast and have enjoyed catching up on earlier episodes and hearing your thoughts and philosophy on various topics. One thing I'd like to hear your thoughts on is the decision not to have kids. Let's say you're single, early 30s, low wage, saved enough to own an apartment and have no debt. However, still quite far from being financially free. I hope to be financially independent by the time I'm 40. However, that doesn't account for any dependents nor spouse, just myself. At this rate, I contemplate on skipping having a family, since the entire family unit would not be financially independent. I'm well aware that entrepreneurship is the path to wealth and financial freedom, but I lack the confidence, skills, and passion to build a meaningful business. I keep toying around with business ideas, but most are fleeting, and the excitement wears off after a few weeks. Anyway, I can't see it being worth the stress raising and providing for a family if you have a call of duty for a business that demands your time or a job that demands your freedom. On one hand, you sacrifice time to spend with your family to be able to provide them a good life, education, etc. On the other, you have some time in the short run but will not accumulate wealth nor provide the best upbringing for your kids on being capped to a wage and a boss. Rather than asking anything specific, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the above and what you would do if you were in those shoes, as well as hearing your overall thoughts on the general idea of not having a family or even a partner if you're not financially independent. Look forward to listening to more of your podcast. Great work." All right, so I thought that was a very interesting email. There's a number of things that he talks about in the email. Just to put one of them aside, first of all, he talks about the question of entrepreneurship and basically how he doesn't feel that it's for him, even though he thinks it's a good way of making money. And I think I've talked about that topic on other episodes. I will just briefly say that I know some people don't like entrepreneurship or just don't feel comfortable being an entrepreneur or just don't get the inspiration or whatever it is. It's not for some people. And if that's the case, I think there are other options. And that's really why I wrote the book Job Free, 4 Ways to Quit the Rat Race and Achieve Financial Freedom on Your Terms. Because although I did entrepreneurship, there are other approaches, in particular the extreme saving approach, which is a very different approach to achieving financial independence and one that many other people have followed, and probably most people who write about financial independence and do podcasts about it are extreme savers. So that's definitely something that you can investigate and look at the other options. You don't have to become an entrepreneur. And if you're thinking about the other options, then check out my book, Job Free. So that's the entrepreneurship question. But the other main question that he asked in this email is, do you have to choose between financial independence and kids? That's what I got from his email, was this sense that it might be nice to have kids, but if he were to try to start a family, then the goal of financial independence would be off the table, or at least would be so stressful that the whole thing kind of wouldn't be worth it. And I understood from his email that he's currently on track to become financially independent by the time he's 40, but that doesn't take into account a partner and raising kids and so forth. So do you have to be single or at least have no kids in order to become financially independent? Well, I know quite a few people in the financial independence sort of blogosphere and general interest group that do have kids. One good example, I think, is the guy who writes the Root of Good blog. His name is Justin, and I think he has 3 kids, and he definitely started a family long before he became financially independent. And he writes about how he did this on his blog. I know, for example, he lives in an area of the USA where housing costs are very cheap, and he does have a good job. He's an engineer, and he's a very frugal person, as is his wife, and as they are together, as they're very frugal as a family unit. So certainly for this question, do you have to choose between financial independence and kids? There's definitely people who show that you don't have to choose, that you can pursue financial independence and also start a family. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy, and it doesn't mean that it won't take you longer than if you didn't have kids. But I think there are interesting examples of people out there who are doing this or have done this. And I think it's also really worth thinking carefully about just how much of a drain having a family is financially. I mean, for example, obviously, if you live together with someone, then you do make savings. You make significant savings. And many of the different studies that have been done on this have wildly different numbers for how much cheaper it is for 2 people to live together than it is for one person to live alone. The most credible estimates that I've read are around 35% cheaper each, because obviously you can share housing costs and utilities costs and so forth. But that's taking into account your spouse or partner. What about your kids? I mean, how much of a drain are kids? And I think that really depends on what your values are. Again, I know of other people who have pursued financial independence and also started a family during that process, or in one case after achieving financial independence, who talk about how important it is for them to have a different approach to raising kids and to have different values as far as raising kids are concerned. I'll put a link in the show notes to this episode to an article by a financially independent couple called Go Curry Cracker, or they write a blog called Go Curry Cracker. And they write about how their values really dictate how expensive it is going to be to raise kids. So, for example, if they live frugally, then the idea is that they'll be able to continue a frugal lifestyle with kids, because the approach that they're taking is to focus on spending quality time with kids and making sure that you can have a great family environment for them, which doesn't necessarily involve spending a lot of money. In the article, he provides a link to an article that appeared in Wired magazine called The 5 Best Toys of All Time. And the toys are things like a stick, a piece of string, a box, a cardboard tube, this kind of stuff. So it really depends on your values. And obviously that's very true of education as well. There are very expensive options for education, and then there are options like homeschooling. Obviously, there's pros and cons to all these things. So my point here is not to map out a specific course, but just to say that it really depends on what your values are and how you approach it. I do believe that the most important thing for kids is having parents who stay together, who love each other, who have a stable home, and who really take interest in their kids and care for their kids. And that doesn't necessarily mean spending money. So I think that's definitely worth thinking about. But my main point about this question of do you have to choose between kids and financial independence is that the totally key variable in all of this is whether or not you're in a relationship with someone who's interested in financial independence as a goal in life. That is more important than anything else about whether or not you should consider this to be a trade-off that you have to make between being more or less single and pursuing financial independence, or being together with someone and even considering starting a family. Because it's very true that if you're in a relationship with somebody who has a different approach to money than you, then they can spend money just as fast as you save money. And even if you don't fully combine your finances, there will still be a huge impact on your level of spending just because you'll be spending time together and you'll have the same kind of lifestyle choices. So the person that you're with is the all-important key variable in whether or not you can pursue financial independence and also start a family. If you're both dedicated to financial independence as a life goal, then you can look at how to think about how you want to combine that life goal with having kids, and think about what kind of trade-offs you're willing to make. Are you willing to try and live in a cheap accommodation area like the guy who runs the Root of Good blog does? Are you willing to take a kind of more homegrown approach to entertainment for your kids, like I talked about with Go Curry Cracker? These are the kinds of things that you can potentially do and also pursue financial independence, but only if you're both on the same mindset when it comes to this question, because otherwise you're going to be working against each other, and that will be a total disaster. So this question, do you have to choose between kids or financial independence, really boils down to the question, can you find a life partner who shares your values and shares your mission in life or some of your goals in life, especially when it comes to things like financial independence and kids? If you can find someone who has those goals or who can get excited about those goals when you talk to them about it, then that makes all the difference. And of course, many people haven't really even thought about financial independence. So it's not that you have to go out and find someone who's already dedicated to this. It's a question of whether or not you find a partner who, when you talk to them about this being one of your passionate goals, whether that's something that they can get enthused about and get interested in. That is the key question. So I don't think you have to choose between financial independence and kids. I think it's definitely harder, much harder, to reach financial independence if you want to start a family, but people do it. And the key variable is what your partner wants and whether your partner's working towards the same goal. Having kids is another one of those big life choices, which I think it's really interesting to think very consciously about and evaluate the different options about. And I've just been reading a book called Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids by the economist Brian Kaplan, which has some interesting data about this. I've talked about Brian Kaplan in previous episodes. I've done a couple of book reviews of his books. One was The Myth of the Rational Voter. I talked about that in the Rationality series. And I also did a review of his book, The Case Against Education. I'm not going to do a full book review in this episode, but it did have some interesting data in it that I thought I would share with you about some of the choices around having kids. So as he's an economist, he likes to look at cost-benefit types of data and real-world evidence on how people evaluate whether or not having kids was beneficial to them and whether it was worth the cost, so to speak. And in the book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, he is making a polemical argument that, in his view, the data is that if you're going to have kids, it actually makes sense to have more kids. And in saying this, he's kind of speaking against the overall trend, which is for people to have much smaller families than they used to. And he's providing in this book some arguments about why you might consider having more kids and why he thinks that that is overall a beneficial thing to do and that the benefits outweigh the costs, so to speak. So that's his argument. And I'm not going to go into the details of the rest of the ideas that he puts forward in that argument, but I will share with you some interesting bits of information that he presents along the way, which I found quite interesting. One bit of data that he looks at is whether or not people who have kids say that they are happy with the idea of having had kids. In other words, do people regret having had children? And this is a kind of survey where he's trying to measure in economic terms what you might call buyer's remorse. If you were to apply that to, say, a typical product that somebody might buy. If someone buys a car and you do a questionnaire survey afterwards and say, are you happy that you bought this car? Then you can look at what percentage of people are happy and what percentage of people turn out to be unhappy with their purchase. And he looks at data to apply this same kind of economic analysis to kids and to see, do people overall say that they were happy with having kids? So I'm going to read you an interesting bit about the findings. Oh yeah, just to say also, he also wants to look at, do people who did not have kids say that they are happy with the decision not to have kids? So this is what he found. He says, In 1976, Newsday commissioned the highest quality survey ever conducted on the subject and found buyer's remorse was awfully rare. When asked, if you had to do it over again, would you or would you not have children? 91% of parents said they would have children all over again. Only 7% said they wouldn't. You might object that people merely rationalize whatever decision they made, but the best available survey finds that non-buyer's remorse is common. In 2003, Gallup asked childless adults over the age of 40, if you had to do it over again, how many children would you have, or would you not have any at all? Over 2/3 of the people without kids confessed regret. Bottom line, a supermajority of parents want every kid they've got. So what I thought was interesting about that is that he is looking at this question of what people self-report about whether or not they felt that it was the right choice or whether it was worth it. And he makes the suggestion that you can compare people who did have kids and people who didn't, because even though people might just justify whatever decision they've made, more people feel justified in having had kids than those who didn't have kids. So in other words, you're much more likely, on average, to express regret about not having kids than you are about having had kids. Now, of course, this is self-reporting, and it might be the case that it's more socially acceptable to regret not having kids than having had kids. So there are always questions about the data, but I thought it was a very interesting bit of evidence, a real-world empirical bit of evidence. And the result is that nearly everyone who has kids does not express regret about having had kids, but a significant proportion of people who don't have kids express regret about that decision. However, that's whether or not people express regret. What about the question of whether or not having kids makes you happier or unhappier? And the interesting thing here is that there are a number of survey findings that show that having kids does reduce your overall reported level of happiness. And Bryan Caplan has some interesting comments on that statistical result in his book. So I'm just going to read you out what he says about that. He says, every child makes you about 1 percentage point less likely to call yourself very happy. The difference is real, but you need a statistical microscope to detect it. Married people, by contrast, are 18 percentage points more likely to be very happy. If you're married with children, you're far more likely to be happy than if you're single and childless. Taken too literally, the statistics imply that married couples require over a dozen kids to feel worse than childless singles. So I think that's an interesting finding. The big difference is between people who are single and people who are married, and marriage, according to the statistics, leads to a significant 18 percentage point increase in people reporting themselves to be happy. But having kids does reduce your happiness by 1 percentage point for each kid. So I thought that was a very interesting finding. And what I take from it is that, yes, you do have a small reduction in your happiness from having kids, presumably because it is really hard work and it can be stressful and so forth. But the reduction is really quite small in comparison to, say, the increase that you get in happiness from being married. Another bit of interesting data that Bryan Caplan presents in this book of his is about how people feel about the activity of looking after children, how they rate that experience compared to other activities. Because another thing that people have looked at is whether or not looking after kids is something that people find fulfilling, or whether, in fact, it's something that they don't enjoy doing. And Bryan Caplan has an interesting summary of that data as well. So I'm going to read that out to you. He's talking about a study of 16 different activities, and these were all things from working and commuting to leisure activities, watching TV, and childcare as well was one of those things. And people were asked to rate how much enjoyment they got from these different activities. This study was done by Kahneman, I think. So Bryan Caplan's just summarizing the data, and he says, childcare comes in 12th out of 16 activities and easily beats the most time-consuming activity of the day, working. And there is virtually a 6-way tie between shopping, preparing food, talking on the phone, napping, taking care of children, and computer use. Last, notice that the top 7 activities, from sex, intimate relations, to watching TV, are all forms of recreation. As far as work-like activities go, enjoyment of childcare is slightly above average. If the Kahneman study has a big social message, it's not that kids are a disaster for happiness. It's that women enjoy taking care of children more than working outside the home. The only thing women like less than being at their jobs is getting to and from their jobs. Childcare isn't a picnic, but it beats a paying job. So I thought that was an interesting summary of the findings too. And the idea there is that, yes, childcare is not as fun as having sex or watching TV. Well, I mean, I don't think that's a particularly surprising result, but it kind of makes sense when you think about it. Childcare is a kind of work. It is something that involves responsibility, and it's not a complete leisure activity. It's not something that you do just for your own satisfaction or for fun. It's something that you are essentially working at. But the point that Brian Kaplan is making is that when you ask people about it, it's considered to be much more fun than actual paid work or commuting. And so he's making the point that you shouldn't expect childcare to be a picnic, but it beats a paying job as far as levels of enjoyment are concerned. So those were some interesting bits of data that I found in Brian Kaplan's book. He doesn't talk a lot in that book about the financial cost of having kids, which is a very thorny subject and difficult to come to a kind of final number on, because it obviously depends on a lot of lifestyle choices about how you choose to raise your kids. But just looking at the data, some numbers that I've seen are for the US in 2013, the average US family will spend $245,000 by the time the child reaches 18 years of age, which doesn't include the cost of college. That's from a US government estimate, I believe, on the cost of kids up to the age of 18. I also found data from a UK study, but this was up to the age of 21, and that was an average cost of £229,000. And the main cost involved in the UK study was the additional housing cost of having an additional bedroom. And that's probably reflective of the fact that housing is just so expensive in the UK. So those are some numbers about the cost of having kids. I've also seen some interesting data from people like Go Curry Cracker. They make the argument that those numbers are way too high because they sort of reflect typical consumer spending patterns, whereas if you want to live the sort of more frugal, extreme saving lifestyle, then you can also apply that to raising kids too. But I think it's an interesting question. Brian Kaplan's data is much more about whether or not it is emotionally or psychologically worth having kids in terms of the way that you're going to feel about it and what people report about their own experience of raising kids. So I thought that was some really interesting data to think about in terms of this decision of whether or not to have kids. As I've spoken about before, I'm extremely happy with having made the choice to have kids, and we are really enjoying the process. But I do think it's interesting for everyone to weigh these things up for themselves and to look at the evidence that is out there in a kind of dispassionate way and think about where they fit within some of these evaluations. These are obviously average numbers based on these studies, but I think it's an interesting approach that you can take to all of these life questions, to look at them as objectively as possible. And I hope that helps in thinking about making the right decisions for yourself to live a life of your choosing. So that's all for this episode. I hope you found that interesting, and I'd love to know what you think.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.